At the edge of an international border, at the edge of the Pacific, at the edge of innovation, community, education, and discovery, you're listening to At the Edge of It All, a University of San Diego podcast where USD experts speak on topics and stories that impact you and the broader community.
Hello, I'm Elisette Martinez.
And I'm Elena Gomez. And with us today, we have Sarah Federman. She's an associate professor of conflict resolution at the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so we always like to kind of start and learn a little bit more about how you got to where you are today. How did you get started in something like conflict resolution?
Yeah, it actually happened almost by accident. I was living in Paris working in advertising. I had started my advertising career in New York, and then they transferred me to Paris, and I was just kind of enraptured with, life in Paris. But what was starting to catch my eye was the real aftermath of the world wars, because I would go to different offices, or different European offices, and I'd move around France and just enjoy Europe. But you can't get around Europe without seeing the wake of the world wars. And for some reason, it started to kind of bother me, like, oh my God, I mean, I knew it was big, but I didn't know it was this big. And you really feel the aftermath there in the way that you don't in the United States, or I didn't feel it growing up in quite the same way. And one day I was rollerblading along the Seine, which they close it every Sunday, and then I took my rollerblades off. A lot of restaurants are closed on Sunday in France, so I went to the Jewish neighborhood where they have falafel, and on my way I passed a Holocaust memorial. So I thought, I'll go take a look. So I put my rollerblades in the scanner, went through security, and I started to look around. And I thought, I wonder, they had a memorial wall with the names like many museums do. And I just wanted to see if there were any Federmans, because it's a very common Jewish last name. But I was shocked, actually, when I saw my own name in the wall, and it was embossed. And it was embossed in the wall the same way it was in the wall of where I lived in Paris. So it just had this feeling of, that was like a piece of me that was deported. And she was 16 when she was murdered at Auschwitz. And they didn't know anything about her at the museum, just kind of had her name. But it was really haunting. And it reminded me of a question asked by my request, really, by my former history professor who became a friend, who said, when you get to Paris, find out if those train drivers kept their jobs after the war. So he wanted to know the people who drove those deportation trains. So most of the people who arrived at death camps in World War II arrived by train. So there were just all these drivers. And so he was like, what happens after the war? What happens to the people who do the little jobs? And when I saw my name, I thought, I'm going to find out the answer to that question. So I just started kind of researching, and I stumbled into a part-time master's program. Well, they made one for me, which was so nice. And then I kept studying the trains, and I was meeting with the train company to find out what happened, and archivists and historians and Jewish leaders, and it just kind of got going. And one day I get a call, and from my boss saying, well, where are you, today? It's Tuesday. And I was like, oh, I'm actually in the archives. Like, I just kind of forgot to go to work. I was just like so taken by these trains, and I was chasing this story. And then I went for a PhD, and then, now it's become a book. But I was just wanted to know if the train drivers kept their job after the war. And then it snowballed because was a conflict in the United States over whether those trains should be allowed to pitch for business. So like the high-speed rail in California, they pitched for that one, the French Railway. They pitched for Maryland, Virginia, Florida, New York. And so they were meeting all this resistance with Holocaust survivors. So I began to kind of then find out what was happening in the U.S. And that's when the story kept going, because then the conflict was alive. There was still a conflict about this something that I thought was just historical.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah. Prior to that, were you into history? Was this even like something that maybe you kind of had like a little inkling
She sounds like a journalist.
Yeah, or a journalist. Was that even like a nugget in?
Yeah, I guess in fairness, like I did study history undergraduate. Okay. And I was like a humanitarian at heart. I just kind of like tried business, and it was fun. And it's fun to travel the world. It's fun to meet all the different people and to see the inside of NFL and Discovery and Google. And, I was kind of having a good time. But I knew eventually, but I didn't know what would bring me back to it, and I didn't know how to get back from it. I mean, I didn't want to leave all the affluence of business. It was like to go study history.
It was divine intervention.
It was divine. It felt like not a choice to some degree. Yeah. But then the book did win a journalism award because I guess it sort of had a journalism quality to it because I was hunting for the story, I guess, to a degree.
So walk us through what that research looked like. You kind of touched on it, but what
Yeah.
did the research look like, and what were some of the takeaways that you found from the book? Because it was just released, last year?
Yeah, last year.
2021?
So I started safely, I thought, in the archives because I'm an American, I'm in Paris, I'm mucking around in somebody else's history, and so I just kind of wanted to know what people knew about that period. So I began that way, but right away, first day in the archives, somebody says, "What are you studying?" And I was trying to get my ID card at the National Archives. "Oh, well, you can't study this without talking to Serge Klarsfeld, who is a famous Nazi hunter and Holocaust activist in Paris, in France, probably the most famous. And he happened to live on my street. She gave me his number, so I went to his house." So already the story was going. I was no longer in the archives, and he's handing me original roundup orders from the French police, and he's telling me these stories. So I went from kind of moving between archives. I sort of snuck into a train conference in France where the SNCF was, and I approached the chairman of the company and was like, "Hi," in my best French at the time. "I'm a student. I'm trying to learn about the trains." And so he gave me the card of one of his senior executives. So I started meeting with the train company repeatedly, meeting with Jewish leaders. And then that's what I did mostly in France, kind of figuring that out. And then when I came to the US for my PhD, I was right in Virginia where it was blowing up. And then it was time to meet with the Holocaust survivors and some of the lawyers involved with it. So I sent out a message through the Holocaust Museum in DC, but it took my breath away how many people responded. I didn't know. I met some survivors in France, and they would tell me somebody else, and I'd go to events and I'd meet people that way. But then this email went out, and my voicemail filled up for days. And my email just filled up. Like, people wanted to talk about what had happened. And it was people who were in France during the war, Jewish, so that group. And so I ended up interviewing 90 of them, which was far more than I expected. And, they wanted to, I just needed to know what they felt about the train company. But they would start in 1938, and then we would go through the whole story and the aftermath. And to your question, what was the most moving, the book goes through the past and all of the debates in the present, the law, the legislation, how it went to the State Department. But every chapter ends with a story about the people that it happened to. And so I follow 4 main people in the book all the way through from 1938 till today. And you get to find out they were all on the last train from Paris to Auschwitz. And so you get to find their stories. And meeting them and their stories is what is most impactful.
Yeah.
Which goes to the name, right?
Yeah, and it was funny when you can't write a book about 90 survivors because my dissertation was 700 pages, but you can't do that for a book. So I just started writing about the people that the stories that stuck with me, that wouldn't let me go. And I was on a writing residency, and I just started, because it was very quiet for 5 weeks, I was able just to write. And then I realized in writing up their stories, they were all on that train. And this train left after D-Day. So after the Allies had arrived to liberate France, there were still trains going.
Oh.
So very haunting to be on a train knowing that the Allies have landed to liberate France and you're being sent to a death camp, right? So meeting these people who survived that, or her parents survived it, or were in hiding, it's what moves my work now, because they've mostly passed away, so many of them.
Share with us what you learned through the writing of this book and interviewing these families about what they thought about the drivers of those trains and, the industry itself.
Yeah, it's such a good question. Gosh, they really didn't agree, which really makes sense when you think about it. But in the news, you'd start to think that everybody was after the train company, all the survivors. But a number of them had really different, nuanced views, which I think is so important conflict to remember, that the violence and the losses affect people really differently. And the path to forgiveness or justice or healing, whatever that looks like, is going to be individual. And that not to judge other people's paths. So some felt that train company should never be allowed to do business in the United States or anywhere, no matter what, right? Some thought, it was such a complicated time. It was occupied France. The SNCF, this French railway, they didn't start World War II. They were occupied too, and those train drivers didn't have a lot of choice. So a lot of people said I was under constraint too. I was at Auschwitz and had to do things, and they had to do things, and that's just war, and a lot of people tried to do good. So there was a real difference of opinion. Some people didn't want to punish the train company of today. They thought, why should I punish the French taxpayers of today? It was their parents. It wasn't even them. So I think it really helped as we in the U.S. start to look at slavery atonement and indigenous and the ills of colonialism, this story really taught me kind of what to do, what not to do, or what we might need to be thinking about as we process this together.
And why don't you share some of that with us? Because I think it is very important what you just mentioned, that people process trauma in a very different way, right? And how they are willing to forgive, and some not willing to forgive, and it's such an individual process. Yeah. So talk to us about what you've learned in your capacity as an expert in this field now.
Yeah, I think one is creating a lot of room for that variety, right? And also some of these processes you try to work towards reconciliation, but you can't push somebody to forgive. They've been through a lot, and I think this trauma also affects people in ways that they don't understand, and that makes sense. We're learning more about transgenerational trauma, the way these traumas pass down in families and through generations. So sometimes the second generation of Holocaust survivors would be very angry because their parents seemed passive to them, and they weren't fighting for justice, so they fought for it. And maybe that their parents were just too wounded to be able to do that fight, so the kids took it on. And the kids became driven in ways sometimes that they didn't even understand themselves, right? And so I think creating space for those conversations, remembering that, especially now when we're coming into institutions that have these histories, and any institution over the 50 years has got something going on, that when we're working through it, and I do think it's important to work through it, to remember that the people in front of you, the current leaders, if they didn't do those things, remember that they didn't do those things. Right. Because it's so easy to treat them like the slaveholder, the Nazi, the oppressor. And now they need to step up and help and take ownership of these legacies. But I think it's important as advocates, we need to partner with them. And then I'm actually I've now kind of shifted into communicating with corporate leaders about how they can better do this. So written for the Harvard Business Review, and I'm working on some other pieces. Actually, just this morning, I was editing that. That's why I was a little bit late. But working on how do you, when you inherit these institutions, and when we are part of them, right? We are part of institutions, and we use brands, and we're all kind of complicit in many ways.
How did you, marry what you were doing before with what you're doing now? I'm sure it came very much handy.
Yeah, I'm so glad. I'm so glad I had that experience. And when people are doing something, they're like, "It wasn't my dream to do this." I'm like, "Keep doing it because it'll feed in later if you keep going."
It's all part of the plan.
Yeah.
It was
It's
divine
all part of the
intervention,
plan.
right?
Because I think I wouldn't have been as comfortable with business executives, or I think it's really easy if you're not a business person or don't see yourself that way to think of companies as just these evil empires.
Right.
And not understanding that the people inside them are I met so many wonderful people, and they were just working. They did what they enjoyed. They were, trying to make their lives work, send their kids to college. They're not sitting there being like, ha, 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 how can we destroy the planet, right? And yet, sometimes they do,
Yeah.
So then how do we deal with that we can be, we're not bad people doing it, but we can still kind of be complicit in how we can make better ethical decisions within our institutions or guide our institutions. So I think it helped me, one, feeling comfortable with business, and two, remembering that it's the people inside.
What are some of the things that you think we should all know about just conflict and peace and what we can all do? What role do we have as individuals in this big picture?
Yeah, so much, actually. And I hope that's heartening, not overwhelming. But one is remembering that when we're talking about conflicts, to do think about how we're portraying ourselves and others. We like to either be the hero or the victim, but we never want to be the perpetrator. So we kind of export that role. One thing we can do is we can allow more room for complexity. Like during the war, the people taught me that people played overlapping roles. They were a perpetrator in one sense, but then they were saving somebody else and, a victim of something else. And so you see this, and people in conflict zones know this very well. So we recently did another book on this, my husband and I, about kind of these complexities. So remembering that it can be complicated, and saying that people play complex roles doesn't mean you're giving them an out. There's still accountability, right? We still want to be responsible for harm. That's one. And something that the Holocaust survivors taught me, maybe inadvertently, is that it's never too little when you're helping, even in big conflicts, and it's never too late. Because they would remember, if someone just handed them a glass of water, they're on the train and they got water, or someone just encouraged them or was kind. They remembered this tiny kindness, even though the person couldn't stop the war. And they also said that it's never too late, in the sense that you were able to for me to express care about what had happened to them 70 years ago mattered to them today. You can feel like it's so long ago. Why does it matter if I care?
Right.
You know, but they actually appreciated it. Some of them, yeah.
What did you learn the most throughout this? I know you've shared some of the things that came about, but if you can encapsulate it in one phrase, like what did you take away out of all these years that you spent kind of researching this, working on this, and now that you're here at the Kroc School of Peace Studies and you're continuing in this new phase of your life, like what is that one thing that resonates to this day?
Great question. I think that I wake up every morning and I'm so satisfied with what I do. It doesn't mean that every day is bliss, and even though I work on genocide and mass atrocity, but it feels so good to be living aligned with what matters to in my deepest self. And I think that is really gratifying.
Yeah.
And you know what? That's funny because that's what I get from you.
Yeah,
you're
you
just
can feel
so
the passion.
happy about what it is that you're doing. And I think a lot of us kind of forget sometimes and go through the motions. I feel the same way. I'm very happy in what I do now in my life. So I think that's very hopeful for people, right? Kind of pursue what you're passionate about, and it will always work out in the end.
It worked out. I mean, messy, and I didn't know what was going to happen at each. I had no plan. I mean, I finished the master's. I had no plan. I finished the PhD. No plan. Just followed it. Not that I recommend that way of living, but I do find it's gratifying when you can live in alignment with your values, even though we're still all compromised in some way. We're using plastics and this, and, so.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. This was a really interesting conversation, and really appreciate your time being here. And if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to catch our next one.
And pick up her book.
Yeah.
Thank you.